Hey guys, welcome to Ed Puzzle 7. I thought I could probably do it in 7, but I think we're going to end up hitting 8. So if we look at where we left off, we were just saying that under the five good empires, the Empire of Rome really hit its peak in size, in way of life, with their money, and so forth. So if we look at the way of life in the Roman Empire under its peak time, okay, there were a lot of people that lived in the cities. Cities in the Roman Empire were the center for culture and business and government, just like they are in our world today. Rome in the Roman Empire, of course, was one of the largest cities during ancient times. Okay, if we looked at how Rome was planned out, okay, it was planned carefully. So they had all the streets, aligned at right angles. Everything led to the forum or the marketplace. The emperor himself still lived on that palace on the hillside because we know that that is probably the most protected area for leaders during this time. At the bottom of the hill, like in Greece, we talked about the Acropolis and the Agora. Okay, in Rome, the empire lived in this palace on the hill, but at the bottom of the hill was the Forum, which was the same thing as the Agora. It was the marketplace. It was probably one of the most active parts of the city and so forth. If we looked at wealthy Romans, a lot of times they lived outside the city limits, usually on hills as well. Oftentimes they owned the most land. Their places were very magnificent looking. They used a lot of marble. They had running water. They had these courtyards called atriums. We know that word in today's world. A lot of times they also owned villas. Villas are still very common throughout Europe. If you own a villa, you have like a large parcel of land. Usually agriculture is taking place and so on. If we look at a lot of the Romans during this time period, though, we know that a lot of them are poor. We talked about that a number of times. They were artisans or skilled workers. They were unemployed. So if we look at where the poor lived, they tended to live like within the city. A lot of times they lived in like wooden apartment buildings. They didn't have their own home or a parcel of land. We know that they had the policy of bread and circuses. We talked about that earlier, kind of to make that happiness, that little bit of a band-aid. Okay, that they put on. Boy, the sun is just, I don't even know where I should move. I guess I'll go here. So if we have the bread and circuses, we know that they provided them free food every day and forms of entertainment. Now, the two common forms of entertainment that they had were something called the Circus Maximus, which was an arena where they would hold chariot races. The poor were allowed to attend free of charge. We also had the Colosseum, where people would watch the gladiator fights. I will spend a little time on this in some activities that we do within our classroom. With the gladiators, they would fight each other to death, or they would fight wild animals. If they were able to succeed, sometimes they were able to gain their freedom this way. If we looked at gladiators, typically they were enslaved people, oftentimes criminals, prisoners of war. Sometimes they took the poor people off the streets and had them be gladiators. And the only way to win your freedom was if you survived a number of times and the emperor let them be free. Of course, gladiators were very admired for their bravery and their skill. The poor people really had their backs. They cheered for them and so forth because they wanted them to earn their freedom. This is just showing a picture of the Colosseum where you can visit today. And in the top two photos, you can see, just some depictions of how they fought or what they fought. If we look at the Roman family during this time, it's very similar to how Greece ran, where males were typically in charge and women were not. This was really the heart of Roman society. During this time, the families were quite large. As they were throughout history, usually large families equaled more workers. The fathers were always the head of the household. They were completely in charge of all the rules and the kids and so forth. Fathers at this time had the right to sell their kids into slavery or have them put to death if they didn't feel that their kids were good enough to be Roman, or if they needed to earn extra money for their family, they could sell their kids. As time passes, women get a few more rights, but never equal to the males. They did realize that this idea that fathers could sell their kids was probably wrong, and sometimes these families became smaller. Especially depending if they were a shopkeeper or a farm owner. Farm families tended to have more kids, and shopkeepers did not. And this is pretty common throughout the world, throughout history. Even if we look at early day United States, families were really big. 1800s, early 1900s. Okay, and then they tended to decline as time goes on. If we look at upper class families, fathers were responsible for providing education. Most of the time the kids were taught at home. Later on, boys were able to go to school. Girls studied with their mom and learned a trade of some sort. If they were poor, usually both boys and girls were just taught at home because they couldn't afford schooling, okay, which was very common. Typically, they were taught the family trade. If they owned a farm, they were taught how to farm and so forth. Some interesting things, as boys became older, at age 15 they were considered adults. This was celebrated, so not by having a birthday party, but typically they would burn all their toys as the offerings to the gods to show that they were an adult. At this time, this is where their attire changed. So instead of wearing their normal attire as kids, boys would then start wearing the togas, the white togas, to represent that they were an adult in the family. At age 15, they would start to work in their family business. They would join the army. They'd get a job, okay, and so forth. So at age 15 was just that age of adulthood. Women typically was married off about 14. Again, the parents typically had this right to determine who their daughters married at this time. They were not full citizens, just like they were in Greece, and had very few rights in society. Some families, women were pretty influential at home, and they advised their husbands in private, okay, but this was not a public thing. That was very not okay, I guess, for lack of a better term. Okay, during the time of the empire, some of the emperor's wives gained power. Just as an example, Septimus, he was an emperor. His wife, Julia Domna, she was in charge of the political affairs when he was gone, okay, and that was kind of unheard of. That was really a new thing during that time frame. If we look at women, of course, everything depended on her husband. Wealthy women could own land, they could run a business, they could sell property. They were heads of the household only with the idea of slaves. Okay, so slaves did the work, letting them have time to educate their children. Women were able to attend the theater, they were able to attend the races, but they could not sit by their husbands. They usually sat in like a higher area, not in a good place, completely separated from the men. Poor women had less freedoms. Poor women excuse me. Sorry about that. So then if we're looking at poor women, they had less freedoms. They did help their husbands. They did a lot of the housework and so on. Poor women were allowed to leave their shop, worship, go to baths. They did not have to have a man in attendance like they did in Greece. Sometimes they had good jobs like doctors, hairdressers, priestess, but they weren't really paid for these positions. Slavery, just like in Greece, was extremely common across their household. As Rome gained more territory, of course, slavery grew because a lot of those conquered people were enslaved. Just as an example, when they took over, the whole peninsula of Italy, about 40% of those people were enslaved. Slaves had many jobs. A lot of times they did the building of roads, they mined, they farmed, etc. They worked on the latifundias. Some of these people were pretty well educated. If you're conquering territory, these were people from all sorts of jobs. So some were teachers, some were doctors, some had specialized jobs, but again, they were slaves. So no matter what they did in their previous lives, once they became a slave, they did whatever was told of them. Life for slaves, we really don't have to talk about how their life was. Typically this was miserable. They have no freedoms. They were controlled by another. Oftentimes they were not looked at as humans. And sometimes this caused rebellions because of the amount of slaves that they have. One slave, whose name was Spartacus, so you may have heard of this person. Spartacus was a slave who organized a rebellion, and he had about 70,000 people that joined his rebellion, and they did pretty good. Their idea was that they would rebel and make it to the Alps, because that would be outside the Roman Empire, and they could all go back to their homelands, okay, and become free. However, the Roman army, who was also very strong at this time, was able to crush them. Spartacus was killed, and then whomever was captured that was still alive, they were crucified, which was one of the most common death punishments of the time. If we look at some of the other things about their way of life, religion we have talked about before. We know that the Romans believed very similar to what the Greeks did, that gods controlled everything. in the area. They adopted the Greek mythology, but the only thing that they did was really just give them Roman names. So, Zeus that we talked about in the Greek religion, he became Jupiter. Aphrodite became Venus. So a lot of the stories remained the same, just that the Roman names were different. Emperor Augustus did impose a new law or belief that made it official in mythology that all emperors were also considered gods. So an average human being became an emperor because the gods gave them, that power. So essentially they were a god as well. With the gods, very similar to Greek culture, they were worshipped, there were ceremonies, there were offerings to them. Most Roman homes had an altar in which they would worship these different household gods. They would offer them, different things like wine and honey. Incense was very common during this time frame. Roman officials made offerings in temples. Temples were open to all people at this time, so it wasn't just the wealthy that went to the temple. Sorry for all the distractions on this one. When gaining new lands, they were able to allow those people to practice their own religion, so they didn't impose mythology on every person in the Roman Empire. They did allow them that freedom of religion. Again, they were trying to make that happy society. We also talked about Stoicism in the previous unit. We said that Stoics would run their life based on reality, not led by emotions and so forth. Okay, Romans did the same thing. Okay, and they also encouraged people to be active in public affairs, very similar to the Greek culture. If we look at science and art, again, this is just building upon our last unit, so we don't really have to talk about a whole bunch of people. So they're going to look at astronomy, they're going to look at medicine, and they're just going to build upon it. So again, very influenced by the Greeks, copied a lot of the ideas, changed things based on research and so on. One of the scientists that was very common in the Roman times was a guy named Galen. He was a doctor that specialized in anatomy. And did a lot of studies like on the anatomy of the body, the muscle structure, and so forth. Ptolemy, he was an astronomer that we would probably hear about as you get older. He was a guy that lived in Egypt. His big thing was he was tracking the movement of stars and planets and created rules, to explain those movements. So again, they're just building upon what the Greeks already started. Okay, so we can see some of the diagrams of what was occurring. Other things with science art, the Romans built a lot of roads, very similar to the Greeks, but now they're going to specialize more in like concrete and paving. The major road in the Roman Empire was something called the Appian Way. It connected Rome to the southeast part of Italy. It's still there today. But the big things that the Romans did were things like aqueducts. Okay, aqueducts are things that are still used today. The structure of them and how they did it in ancient times is just remarkable of how they came up with that technology. But the key thing of aqueducts was that they could haul in water, okay, from the countryside into the cities. Aqueducts, you have to think they didn't have like any electricity or things that we have today. A lot of this was built off of arches and gravity in order to carry this water long distances. Some aqueducts that they built are still used today. Because they were so good in structure. One other item that the Romans did during this time was something called Roman numerals, and we use Roman numerals today, in book chapters or in outlines. The Romans created this number system to help with their accounting. Okay, we use symbols and letters. We know that different like I's and so forth equal the number system. Okay, we borrowed a lot of that from the Romans that we still use today, and they borrowed it from the Greeks and the Etruscans. Today, another example that we can see is where they use it in the Super Bowl. They use Roman numerals to tell what Super Bowl that we're on. And we are going to stop here, and we have one video left.